Hi everybody. It's Editor Chan. Today I'm going to cover some advanced things you can do with dialogue. While you can get a lot done just using built-in conditions, sometimes you need to do something more customized. For example, your character may need to recall an event that occurred earlier in the game. This is where markers come in. A marker marks an important piece of information for later recall. Markers can work like a flag tracking whether something has or hasn't occurred, or they can work like a variable in programming by storing a number or text. Let's give some examples. First, maybe we don't want the lightning strike from the pose maker tutorials to happen every game, so we'll add another stripping case for that stage with the same priority, so that it'll be random which one gets chosen. If the lightning strike does happen, it would make sense to remember, so we can set a marker named lightning for these lines. The name can be anything as long as it has no spaces. Let's take a detour to the Markers tab. This lists out all the markers that your character sets, a description about what they mean, and whether they are public or private. I'll document these markers quickly. Track shirt came from the collectibles tutorial. Now, let's add a line that plays during the hand quality phase that comments about the earlier lightning strike, using the self-said marker condition. I should also update the stages to only include those that happen after the strike. Some markers, like this lightning strike, make sense for other characters to interact with. Others, like our track shirt marker used for internal collectible counting, are not useful for other characters. This is the difference between a public and private marker. Notice how if I try to target Editor Chan from another player, the said marker condition only includes public markers. Markers can also be used for counting. Let's set up a system for counting how many 3-of-a-kinds I've received during the game. I'll use the self-has hand condition to identify a 3-of-a-kind, and then set a marker to count by clicking the advanced marker setup icon and making the marker increment. This will cause it to count up by 1 each time this line plays. Finally, let's add another case which checks that we have received 5 or more 3-of-a-kinds and make a remark about that. First, let's make sure these cases happen in more than just one stage. So again, we'll check has hand, 3-of-a-kind, and then use Z marker to check that it's more than 4. Since this case has a higher priority than the counting case, we don't need to worry about it not playing. For this next example, I'm going to use a recipe. Recipes create cases with certain conditions populated automatically. I'm going to use a recipe to target when somebody other than me loses the very first hand. Next, I'm going to use a special marker called nickname and put the value, loser, in it. By making this marker per target, it will store a different value for each opponent, depending on who is the target. What the nickname marker does is change what our player calls another one. Since we stored loser in the marker, whenever we use the name variable with them as the target, it will now say loser instead of their actual name. Another special type of marker is a persistent marker. This is a marker whose value is retained across games, which lets your player remember things from a previous game. I'm going to set a persistent marker called played here in the game start phase. Then, in another game start phase, I'll check that persistent marker and say something else to indicate that the player has played with Editor Chan at least once. Notice that persistent markers use their own condition, and not the normal said marker condition. Once you set a marker, it doesn't have to be set for the rest of the game. You can clear it at any point. Here I'm making a condition where if I haven't lost a single time in 10 rounds, I get bored and decide to say nothing but floop until I lose. I'll start this in the opponent lost phase and set a marker called floop. Then I'll make a global case which checks this marker. Since it's global, it'll play in every phase as long as the conditions are met. I want to make sure I have a really high priority so that it'll always play above everything else. Finally, once I lose a hand, I'll clear out the marker. That way the global case will stop triggering, and I can finally say something intelligent again. Markers can also store text for use in later dialogue. In this example, I am making an opponent lost case that will put the name of the target into a variable called loser. Notice that, like with dialogue, you can use variables in a marker's value. I am marking this case as hidden, meaning it will never be used for dialogue, but will instead just set the marker in the background and then play some other opponent lost line. This way I don't have to set the marker for every opponent lost line that I write. Anyway, so here in a follow-up hand quality phase, I use a special variable notation of marker.name of the marker, which will be replaced with the value of whatever is currently stored in loser. Similarly, we can use a per target marker to store information on a per opponent basis. In this example, I'm storing the name of the clothing that an opponent is stripping into a marker called item that is marked as per target. Then, in another case when they lose again, first I check that the opponent has actually lost something already. And then I can use the marker.item variable to print the name of the clothing they lost last time. Historically, markers have been used to make sure a line plays only once by checking that a marker was not said and then setting the marker. Now, there is an easier way. Here we have several good hand lines that we don't want to repeat. By marking a line as play once, it will only play once per game. Of course, we don't want to run out of lines completely, so there should always be lines that aren't marked that way. You can also mark an entire case to play once, meaning only one line from the whole case will ever play in a single game. Here I'm telling some secrets, but don't want to keep spamming them throughout the game. Markers aren't the only thing lines can modify. When a line plays, you can actually change your player's label, or name, gender, chest or crotch size, or AI ability. I realize now that these advanced dialogue options pop-ups are getting cut off in the video, but they should be straightforward to understand without seeing exactly what I'm doing. Another option that is useful when you have two characters in a single picture is to move the speech bubble arrow. By default, the arrow is at 50% from the left side, but you can reposition it. Another thing I'm doing here that you unfortunately can't see is changing the line weight to 2. The line weight controls how likely a line is to be chosen to play from available lines. The default weight is 1, so a weight of 2 makes a line twice as likely to play. Let's switch gears now and talk about images. When you pick a pose for a line, the same pose gets used for every stage. You can override poses for individual stages by clicking the double arrows icon and specifying alternative poses. Everything blank will use the primary pose. Let's talk about one last feature: changing tags based on dialogue. If you recall, the Tags tab lets you change tags across clothing stages, but it's actually possible to change tags at an even more granular level than stage. Let's give a solid example here. I'm having a particularly bad game and have ended up in my underwear before everyone else. Normally, I'm pretty outgoing, but it's a bit awkward being undressed around everyone else. So, if this event happens, I'm going to add the shy tag and use that to start acting shy until someone finally joins me. So first I'm checking that my reverse place is 1, meaning I'm in last place. Editor's note: we should also check that our layers behind is greater than 0, since otherwise this would match being tied for last. Now, I'll switch to the Tags tab and add the shy tag. To actually act shy, we'll need to add cases that check if we have the shy tag, and then write lines accordingly. Let's add a hand quality case, put it in the proper stage, and then use the player tag condition with a check for self has tag shy. Next, we need to stop being shy once we have company, so in an opponent stripped case, we'll make a condition that checks if our layer difference compared to the target is 0, meaning we're tied. If that happens, we'll remove the shy tag. Please be aware that this setup is not adequate. Specifically, we don't have any handling for if we leave the underwear stage before someone else enters it, meaning we'll get stuck with the shy tag for the rest of the game. These conditions also assume that when a character has 2 layers left, they'll be in their underwear, which isn't always a valid assumption. Anyway, that concludes a summary of the advanced features that Dialog offers. With familiarity with these features and good use of markers, you should find that it's possible to write dialogue for almost any situation you can think of. Well, see you next time.